Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 to parents Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. Little did either of them know their baby boy would grow up to be one of the most infamous serial killers in history. As a child, Jeffrey and his father would collect the corpses of animals using chemicals to reduce the flesh to nothing but a pile of bones. In high school, Jeffrey was known as an oddball who didn't quite fit in with any group. He was known to have outbursts and mimic the seizures his mother would have. At this time, he was also coming to terms with his homosexuality. Unfortunately, the fantasies he had at this age already included being intimate with dead bodies. This was something he could never tell anyone. Being the 70s, homosexuality wasn't accepted, let alone his fetish of human corpses. At one point, attempting to fit in, Jeffrey asked a classmate named Bridget Geiger on a date to prom. Unable to properly socialize, Jeffrey left her only a few minutes after arriving to the dance. He later returned near the end of the prom, apologized, and then took her home. Only a month after this prom would Jeffrey Dahmer begin his killing spree. This killing spree is what we'll be exploring today. In June of 1978, 18-year-old Steven Hicks walked through the summer heat hoping to hitchhike to a rock concert in a nearby city. He was known to stay out late, so it wasn't alarming to his parents when he didn't return home that night. Little did the couple know their son had gotten in the car with a driver almost a week previously. That driver's name was Jeffrey Dahmer. After Steven got in the car, Jeffrey drove back to his house, providing his new friend with beer. Steven soon wanted to leave. Shortly after, he headed toward the front door. Unknown to Steven, the man standing behind him was starved of attention and basic human interaction, so unbelievably starved that he had frequent fantasies of being intimate with dead bodies. His desires finally taking over him, Jeffrey struck Steven over the head with a barbell before strangling him to death. At this point, Jeffrey uses a kitchen knife to dismember Steven before placing the body parts in black trash bags. Realizing the severity of what he has done, he places the bags in his car and drives off. Soon, Jeffrey is stopped by the police, and despite being socially inept, he is able to weasel his way out of the situation. When questioned about the bags and what he is doing, Jeffrey explains that they are yard clippings and he is taking a drive to escape the stress of his parents' divorce. After being let go, Jeffrey drives back home. It is there he further mutilates the body of Steven Hicks. According to sources, Dahmer entirely removed the flesh from Steven's body. From here, a sledgehammer was used to crush up the bones. The fragments were then strewn about by Dahmer in the woods behind his house. It would take decades for these to be discovered. When they were, investigators found over 26,000 bone fragments. For reference, this was less than 20% of the complete skeleton. In September of 1987, 24-year-old Steven Tuomi met a man at a location called the 219 Club. Steven, already intoxicated, accompanied him back to his hotel room. Little did he know, he was in the hotel room of Jeffrey Dahmer. Shortly after, Jeffrey slipped sleeping pills into Steven's drink. According to Dahmer, he woke up the next morning to find he had beaten Steven to death, his victim's chest being caved in and blood coming from his mouth. He later stated he had no memory of the murder. In a panic, Jeffrey hid the body in a nearby closet, went to a nearby store and purchased a large suitcase. After returning to the hotel room, the dead body was stuffed into the suitcase. From here, Dahmer wheeled it outside and then got in a taxi, heading to his grandmother's house. According to sources, the body was left in the suitcase for a week before Dahmer decided to get rid of it. Like his first victim, Dahmer stripped off the flesh and muscles and then smashed the bones with a hammer. For 2 weeks, Dahmer kept the head preserved in a chemical solution. Even over 30 years later, no trace of Steven has ever been found. Despite this murder being unplanned and wiped from Dahmer's memory, it would serve as the catalyst for his killing spree. This would be the moment in time where Dahmer gave up on pursuing a semi-normal life and decided to cut through the veil of reality, succumbing to the ungodly temptations of murder, cannibalism, and necrophilia that had been whispering in his ear his entire life. Before I continue, I want to give you a chance to support myself and this channel by purchasing the Junkyard Kids on Amazon. If you're a fan of murder mysteries or just want a good book to read, then this is the novel for you. In the novel, we follow our homeless and mentally deranged protagonist as he attempts to protect his brother in an urban wasteland. If that wasn't bad enough, we find out the reason the two are homeless in the first place is due to their parents being stabbed to death by a merciless serial killer. Soon, the two befriend 3 other homeless misfits, and together, the group seeks shelter in a deserted junkyard. After finally finding some semblance of peace, our protagonist ends up being the witness to a murder. Unfortunately, he gets involved, committing a murder of his own out of self-defense. Knowing the corrupt police officials of the city won't believe their story, the protagonist and his friends dump the bodies in a river. Figuring they'll be caught soon, the group makes plans to escape the city. While they attempt to do so, they come across clues to the identity of the serial killer mentioned earlier. Being encapsulated by the memories of his parents' untimely death, the protagonist abandons his plans of escape and pursues the homicidal lunatic. If this book sounds like your cup of tea, look out for the thumbnail at the end of this video. It'll bring you to a sample reading of this novel voiced by me. And if you purchase the book and like it, be sure to leave a positive review on Amazon. Your review may be featured in one of my videos. Also, a link directly to the book is in the description of this video. Along with physical copies, this book is available in ebook format, so you can download it right now directly to your phone or tablet. With that being said, let's get back to the story. In January of 1988, James Doxtator was a 14-year-old Native American male sex worker. Usually hanging around gay bars for clients, he was offered $50 to take nude photographs one night. The man offering him the money was Jeffrey Dahmer. After accepting the offer, James was brought to Dahmer's grandmother's house. Soon, James was strangled to death by Dahmer. Dahmer then dismembered the body, disposed of it, and then kept the head before disposing of it too. Only 2 months later in March would Dahmer meet Richard Guerrero. Richard, on this night, was described as being clean-shaven with smooth skin and wearing a brown vinyl coat. According to Dahmer's confession to police, Richard was invited to his residence to look at videos and have intercourse. After this, Richard was drugged so he would sleep. Unlike most serial killers, Dahmer claimed he didn't want his victims to suffer, which is why he drugged them. Dahmer wasn't interested in torturing and causing pain to his victims and was more interested in using their corpses for comfort. Now, once Richard was asleep, Dahmer wrapped a leather strap around his neck, pulled tightly, and slowly strangled him to death. Just like his victims before, Richard's dead body was dismembered and then disposed of. With this victim, Dahmer kept no body parts as souvenirs. In March of 1988, Anthony Sears would go to the Milwaukee gay club La Cage. Once the bar closed, Anthony and his friend Bob Keel would be driven by another friend, Jeffrey Connor. Also in the car was none other than Jeffrey Dahmer. Connor dropped Dahmer and Anthony off at Dahmer's grandmother's house. As with the other victims, Anthony was drugged with sleeping pills, murdered, and then dismembered. Dahmer did keep body parts of this victim, the head and genitals. Anthony's head was boiled, the flesh was removed, and the skull kept as a souvenir. Dahmer kept the scalp with its ponytail, later stating that he liked it. Unlike his previous victims, Dahmer would not dispose of this trophy. Fast forward to May of 1990, Raymond Smith, a male sex worker, went with a client to an apartment with the promise of $50 for sex. Shortly after entering the apartment, Raymond was given a drink. Little did he know, the drink had been laced with 7 sleeping pills by Jeffrey Dahmer. After seeing Raymond pass out, Dahmer strangled his victim to death. Raymond's clothes were removed, where Dahmer saw a tattoo on the man's chest which read Cash D. Shortly after this, Dahmer had intercourse with his victim's dead body. The following day, Dahmer purchased a Polaroid camera. This would be the first victim he took pictures of. Raymond was then dismembered in Dahmer's bathroom, boiling the remains in a kettle filled with Soilex, a high pH detergent. Once the Soilex had fully dissolved the flesh and muscle tissue, the skeleton minus the skull was disintegrated in acid. The skull was then spray painted and placed alongside the skull of Anthony Sears. This murder took place within 1 week of Dahmer moving into his new apartment. In 1990, Edward Smith left the Phoenix Bar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. After leaving, he crossed paths with Jeffrey Dahmer. Before that night, Edward had considered Dahmer a friend for some time, even visiting Jeffrey at his apartment. So, on June 14, 1990, Edward had no reason to be skeptical of Dahmer. However, once he was in the apartment, he was offered a drink, and after consuming it, he was fast asleep from the sleeping pills it had been laced with. Once he fell asleep, Edward was strangled to death, his flesh being stripped with a knife and the body being dissolved in a 57-gallon drum in Dahmer's apartment. Again, the skull was kept by Dahmer, this time painting it gray. Edward's other bones were used as ornaments around the apartment. Unfortunately, in 1999, the brother of Edward, Ernest Smith, would be stabbed to death, furthering the pain of the Smith family. On September 3rd of 1992, Ernest Miller would meet Jeffrey Dahmer outside a bookstore in Milwaukee, accepting an offer of $50 to let Dahmer take nude pictures of him. After drugging Ernest with sleeping pills, Dahmer slashed his neck. Unlike the previous 7 victims, this would be the first time he would not strangle his victim to death. It is thought that Dahmer wasn't confident enough that he could overpower Ernest, fearing he hadn't used enough sleeping pills. With Ernest, after dismembering the body and dissolving the flesh, he would save the skull and left bicep, later painting the skull and consuming the bicep. Afterwards, the entire skeleton was bleached and saved by Dahmer. Dahmer would later state himself about this victim, "I separated the joints, the arm joints, the leg joints, and had to do 2 boilings. I think I used 4 boxes of Soilex for each one, put in the upper portion of the body and boiled that for about 2 hours, and then the lower portion for another 2 hours. The Soilex removes all the flesh, turns it into a jelly-like substance, and then it just rinses off. Then I laid the clean bones in a light bleach solution, left them there for a day, and spread them out on either a newspaper or cloth and let them dry out for about a week in the bedroom. I took the knife and the scalp part off and peeled the flesh off the bone and kept the skull and the scalp. If I could have kept him for longer, all of him, I would have." September 24th, 1990. Being down on his luck due to not having a permanent place to live, David Thomas took up an offer for $50 to let a photographer take nude pictures of him. He walked with the photographer to an apartment and was given a drink which he consumed. The man who had given him the drink's name was Jeffrey Dahmer, who had laced the beverage with potent sleeping pills. Soon, David was passed out. However, this victim was different. Dahmer had no desire to have intercourse with him. He did think that David would wake up and be belligerent, so he strangled him to death and did his usual dismemberment. No trophies of this victim were kept. In Dahmer's own words, he wasn't his type. February of 1991. At a bus stop by Marquette University in Milwaukee, 17-year-old Curtis Strotter meets a photographer by the name of Jeffrey Dahmer. Curtis is offered $50 to pose for pictures. He accepts. Like the other men, Dahmer offers Curtis an alcoholic beverage secretly laced with sleeping pills. This time, Dahmer chains Strotter's hands behind his back, then strangles him with a leather strap. As with the others, Strotter is dismembered and dissolved. His hands, genitals, and head are all kept as trophies by Dahmer. Following this murder, Dahmer's descent into madness would continue to grow as he experimented with different methods of control on his next victims. In March 1991, Errol Lindsay was at the corner of 27th and Kilbourne. It was there he would meet Jeffrey Dahmer. As with Dahmer's previous encounters, he would go through his usual procedure of luring his victim to his apartment before handing him an alcoholic beverage laced with sleeping pills. Usually at this point, Dahmer would strangle his victim to death. However, this victim was different. It was Dahmer's deepest, darkest desire to have someone who could never leave. Logically, it makes sense that he was growing tired of all the trouble of finding a victim, luring them back to the apartment, drugging and strangling them, and then having to go through the tedious process of disposing of all the remains. And after all that, he would be only left with a skull, another small prize in the eventual fading memory. What Dahmer wanted was a lobotomized human being who could not move, think, and most of all, reject him. And so, Dahmer took a drill, making a small hole in the top of Errol's skull. He wasn't finished. After filling a syringe with muriatic acid, he filled his victim's cranial cavity with the solution. A few moments later, Errol woke up groggy, confused, and wanting to know what time it was. Unknown to him, his gray matter was slowly being dissolved. To Dahmer, the experiment was a failure. He handed Errol another drink, waited for him to sleep, then strangled and disposed of him like his previous victims. One thing we do find out about this murder is how detached Dahmer's mind was from reality. Along with his cannibalism and necrophilia, his attempt to create a lobotomized slave from his victims shows how he viewed other human beings. They, in fact, were not human beings to him, but objects. With the device you are viewing this video on, you do not think of its emotional state, how its family would feel if it died, or what the device's future plans are. This is how Dahmer's victims were viewed to him. On May 24th, 1991, in a Milwaukee bar, Tony Hughes, who was deaf, met Dahmer. Both had known each other for a few days at that point. Using handwritten notes to communicate, Dahmer invited Tony back to his apartment. It was here that Tony would be drugged with sleeping pills which had been prescribed to Dahmer. As with his previous victim, Errol Lindsay, Dahmer drilled a hole through Tony's skull and injected acid into his brain. Unlike Errol, Tony never woke up. This wasn't Dahmer's intention. Dahmer's intention was to create a lobotomized slave which could not leave, a lobotomized slave which he could have complete control over. His experiment failing a second time, Dahmer disposed of the body by draining it of blood, dismembering it, stripping it of flesh with a knife before finally dissolving the remains in acid. On May 26, 1991, in front of the Grand Avenue Mall in Milwaukee, Konarak Syntha would meet his fate when he met Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer offered him money for pictures at his apartment. As usual, the victim would be drugged, Dahmer abusing Konarak while he slept. Strewn about the apartment were the body parts of Dahmer's previous victims. Around 2 a.m., Dahmer had run out of beer. He left his apartment and headed to a bar called Gare Bear Bar for more. As he was heading back, he spotted Konarak staggering down the street. Dahmer approached him and was stopped by 2 police officers. Dahmer explained that they were lovers and that Konarak was drunk. 2 nearby black women, Nicole Childress and Sandra Smith, protested. Paramedics and the fire department arrived on scene. However, the police soon directed them to leave. Nicole and Sandra further protested, noting that Konarak was bleeding, was obviously drugged, and Dahmer couldn't get his name right. Despite what the woman had pointed out, the officers threatened to arrest the 2 of them if they intervened. The police then escorted Dahmer and Konarak back to the apartment. Soon afterwards, Dahmer strangled Konarak to death, took pictures of the body, then dismembered and disposed of him. Dahmer would later keep Konarak's skull as a trophy. At a Chicago bus station after the 1991 Gay Pride Parade, Matthew Turner would meet Jeffrey Dahmer. Being lured with money for photos, Matthew went with Dahmer on a Greyhound bus and then in a taxicab, eventually ending up in Dahmer's apartment. It was there that Matthew was drugged and then strangled by Dahmer with a leather strap. After dismembering the body, Dahmer kept the head in his freezer. The body was then put in the 57-gallon drum that Dahmer kept in his apartment. Only a month later in July, Jeremiah Weinberger would meet Jeffrey Dahmer in the streets of Chicago at Carol's Speak Easy Bar. Jeremiah was described as being very affectionate towards Dahmer. The pair went back to Dahmer's Milwaukee apartment where they stayed for 2 days. According to Dahmer's confession, Jeremiah wanted to leave at this point. And, as with his first victim and every victim following that one, Dahmer didn't want him to. It was here that Jeremiah was drugged with the sleeping pills. Dahmer was still adamant about creating a living zombie which he could fully control. Once again, he drilled a hole into his victim's skull. Realizing the acid did not work, Dahmer instead poured boiling water into his cranial cavity. And then, for the first time, it worked. At least for a while. Dahmer would later state, he woke up at the end of the day, the next morning, and he was sort of groggy and everything. He talked. It was like he was dazed and I thought I would be able to keep him that way. Jeremiah said nothing about the hole on his head. For 6 hours, he staggered around the apartment dazed and confused, not understanding why he felt the way he did. Being detached from reality, Dahmer most likely didn't realize that Jeremiah wasn't becoming the zombie he desired. Jeremiah was dying. Hours later, Dahmer would drug him again. More boiling water was poured into Jeremiah's cranial cavity. The next morning, Dahmer would find Jeremiah dead with his eyes open. Disappointed by his failed experiment, Dahmer dismembered the body in his bathtub, keeping Jeremiah's head in his freezer and his torso in the 57-gallon drum already filled with other victims' body parts. Oliver Lacey, a 23-year-old bodybuilder, was wandering around the Grand Avenue Mall on July 12, 1991. On that day, he was approached by Jeffrey Dahmer and invited back to his apartment. He agreed. It is there the two engaged in back rubs. From here, Dahmer engaged in his usual methods for his victim, drugging, strangling, and dismembering. However, with Oliver, Dahmer would keep his head and his heart in his freezer. Dahmer's official confession states he did keep his right bicep, which he subsequently fried on the skillet and ate part of it. He said it tasted like beef. July 1991 would be when Dahmer's madness went full throttle, killing a total of 5 people before the end of the month. He was recently fired from his job at the chocolate factory. Along with this, he hadn't been sleeping. Only a few days after Oliver was murdered, Joseph Bradoft would be met by Dahmer near Marquette University. Having a 6-pack of beer under his arm, Joseph was waiting for a bus. After luring him back to the apartment, the two engaged in intercourse. As you can guess, Joseph was murdered. Afterwards, it would be the 17th time Dahmer had drugged, strangled, and dismembered a fellow human being. Joseph's head was placed in his freezer and his torso in the 57-gallon drum with the other victims. In late July of 1991, Tracy Edwards would find himself in the apartment of Jeffrey Dahmer. Upon entering the apartment, Tracy smelled a foul odor. Dahmer explained that a sewer pipe had broken. Tracy also noticed boxes of muriatic acid. Dahmer explained that he cleaned bricks with the acid. Tracy accepted both of these explanations. After a few drinks, Tracy was handcuffed and a knife was pulled on him by Dahmer. Tracy would later recount that Dahmer's demeanor changed from a friendly man to a crazed killer. It is possible that Dahmer, knowing what he was about to do, needed to mentally distance himself from his actions. After being led to the bedroom, Tracy would be forced to lie down. Dahmer put his ear to Tracy's chest, telling him he was going to eat his heart. Throughout the night, Tracy would attempt to calm Dahmer by claiming to be his friend. Once he had the chance, Tracy struck Dahmer before running out of the front door and flagging down the police. Once police entered, they would discover his house of horror. Inside the apartment were the remains of 11 victims. Several human heads were in the freezer and refrigerator. Within a 57-gallon drum in the corner of Dahmer's bedroom, many bodies were found to be decomposing in a solution of chemicals. Polaroid photos were strewn about, showcasing his victims in various stages of dismemberment. Even his computer had 2 skulls on it. Along with this, evidence was found that he had been consuming the body parts of his victims. After his arrest and trial, Jeffrey Dahmer would be sentenced to 15 life terms. Even before being killed by a fellow inmate in 1994, Dahmer admitted that the urges to kill and dismember never went away. I hope you enjoyed watching my video. If you are interested in the book mentioned earlier, go ahead and click the thumbnail on screen to listen to a sample reading of it. Either that, or click the link in the description to be brought directly to the Amazon page to purchase the book. If you're not interested, consider subscribing and sticking around for my other true crime and horror content. That's all I have for now. Until next time.